My dissertation is about the movement of liquid in Old English poetry. It's a semantic field study, which means that I want to examine a range of words in the context in which they appear in the Old English corpus in order to refine their definitions. There's two main resources that are really important for my dissertation. It's the Dictionary of Old English and the Old English Web Corpus. They're created by a team of researchers at the University of Toronto. And the web corpus is the entire corpus of texts in Old English, the poetry and the prose, put together in a searchable format. And based off of that, the collection of all the texts, they created the dictionary. So it's the most comprehensive collection of Old English words. It's really useful because I can use their dictionary in order to get the gist of the words that I'm studying, their preliminary definitions, and then look in the corpus to see how they behave in this context they arise in. So I can search in the corpus and find every instance of a particular word that I want to study and look at its function in the sentence, what's near it, and see how that might influence its definition. I'm undertaking a semantic field study because I believe there's more to be said about verbs of motion in Old English that refer to the movement of liquid. The selection of the words I want to look at is important because it's important to get a full picture of a semantic field. So I used the Old English thesaurus to help me. It's a really interesting resource because they've grouped Old English words together so that you can see the connections between them more easily. All the words that I'm examining are under the heading moisture in the thesaurus, and I chose the verbs that I wanted out of that list. By examining them in the context of the poems they appear in, I can establish more nuanced definitions for what they really mean. The words I intend to investigate are pharan, floan, bestuman, rinan, yeotan, denian, and whalan. This seems like a lot of words, but it's important to get a full picture of the semantic field, so I chose some that were more general and some that were more specific. For example, words like pharan and floan are more general. Sometimes they're not even used of the movement of liquid at all. And then ones like bestuman and whalan will probably have some very interesting definitions caught up in them. I also don't examine every single instance for every word, or at least I won't include them all in my dissertation. I'll include some of the patterns that I see emerging and some of the most interesting points for each of the words. Pharan is the most general verb. It means to go or to move. It's used in a huge number of contexts, and it's not always related to the interests of this study. Floan is a general verb that means to flow, giving rise to present-day English flow. In Old English, it's used in a wide variety of contexts, and it talks about physical and metaphorical objects. So it could talk about the ocean or a river flowing, or it could talk about eloquence flowing. From the starting point of these more general verbs, the meanings of more specific verbs may become elucidated. Bestuman is a verb that's more specific. It means to make moist or bedew. The word itself is related to the Old English word for to steam, steaman, but bestiman is definitely used of liquid and not of steam. Rinan means to run or to flow, so it can be used of an animal or a person's locomotion, which is obviously not relevant to this study, but it can also be used of liquid running down a surface, which is the same as its use in present-day English. Denian is a really interesting word. It has the least clear definition of all, because it really only appears once in the Old English poetic corpus. It's in the Battle of Brunanburh, when it's unclear whether it means to darken or maybe to flow. Yeotan is a really important word as well. It means something like to pour out, and my preliminary research has shown that it's quite general use, but it's often used in relation to crying. Whalan is the last word that I identified that I wanted to look into further, and it means to surge or to boil. Whalan seems to be more associated with emotions than any of the other verbs, so it's more metaphorical than physical. And Leslie Lockett notes that it's often used in mental contexts with negative emotions and also with more positive states of intense love and the desire for God. In my original research proposal for this course, I wanted to establish the nature of the relationship between Anglo-Saxons and marine mammals like whales. I wanted to use literature and archaeology to paint a clear picture of their relationship, but there weren't really enough sources to do this, so it wasn't possible to pursue this line of thinking. But my current idea is based on the same underpinnings, just the consciousness that the ocean and water are so embedded in Anglo-Saxon culture. I believe that Anglo-Saxons had a maritime culture, and they were influenced by living materially on an island, and also spiritually by all the stories in the Bible that relate to water, and all the practices that come out of that, such as baptism. In his book, Anne Lazark makes the argument that Noah and the flood was a very central story for Anglo-Saxons. It allowed them to understand their own place in salvation history and influence their culture to a huge degree. When I first started studying Old English literature, I was really intrigued by the lack of a clear picture that we get of Grendel's mother. It's not clear whether she appears human or appears female, or appears more animal. There's a lot of different terms given to define her, and it's really difficult. But something I found really interesting in Anne Lazark's book was the acknowledgement that the Grendelkin must be amphibious monsters, because they are said to be the kin of Cain in the poem. So they are related to antediluvian evils that God sought to exterminate with the flood. It follows that the only way the Grendelkin could have survived the flood would be if they were capable of surviving underwater. So in Beowulf, we can see how water could be a representation of God's absolute power in the flood, and also how living in water can symbolize some kind of Christian evil in the Grendelkin. We also see numerous instances of the importance of the sea journey in Anglo-Saxon culture, such as a poem like The Seafarer. It's been argued to be a literal sea journey by a peregrinus seeking spiritual salvation. It's also been argued to be a metaphorical journey, thinking about man's life as a journey on the sea that's very taxing, and then contrasting that with the afterlife that's very blissful. It's ambiguous whether sea journeys are thought of as good or bad in Anglo-Saxon culture. In Beowulf, the sea journey seems to be incredible and adventurous, but in poems like The Seafarer or The Wanderer, it seems like the darkest of miseries. The sea is also used as a test, for example, in the Old English Andreas. Andreas has to prove his faith in God by navigating a stormy sea. In Exodus, we can also see water being used as a representation of the dominion God has over nature. He can control water and use it to bring suffering to large amounts of people at his will. There has been some work in approaching Old English literature from an eco-theological perspective. As Neville writes, when used in defining God, the natural world is an entity powered directly by divine will, or an alien force held perpetually in check by divine power, or an autonomous agent which God occasionally uses to display his might but otherwise lets range and rage freely. She sees water in Anglo-Saxon England as something very fearful and negative. We can also see the importance of verbs to describe the movement of liquid in the hydraulic theory of the mind. This is a psychological theory that's relevant to the Anglo-Saxon concept of their own minds and emotions. The mind is often spoken about in terms of pressure rising and falling, as though in a heated container. Leslie Lockett has shown that this model can productively illustrate the relationship to the mind expressed in Old English literature, with specific focus on the word whelan. So far, I've only meaningfully looked into the word besteman. It's clear from my preliminary research that this is a very unique word. It appears to have highly specialized meaning, and it seems to be part of the poetic vocabulary, so it never occurs in prose. From studying its 9 instances total in the poetic corpus, besteman is overwhelmingly used of blood. In 4 instances, it's used specifically in relation to the blood of Christ, and in the last 4, it's used in relation to battles, 3 of which are religious battles, and 1 of which occurs in Beowulf. So let's take a look at the individual instances of besteman in the Old English corpus. I've set them all out here with the Old English and then the translations. As you can see, in all but 1 instance, they talk explicitly about blood. So, for example, in Exodus, the mountainous slopes stream with blood. In Andreas, we have some passages talking about the bloody wounds that he receives, and there's a lot from The Dream of the Rood or other poems that talk about the crucifixion, talking about the blood that pours from Christ's side, or similar scenes. There's only one instance where Bustuman does not talk about blood explicitly, and this is in Andreas, when it talks about the ocean. But later I'm going to show that even this passage relates to the overall meaning of Bustuman, which is to connote a specific type of holy suffering. It can be interesting in a semantic study to look at the poetic style surrounding the word that you're looking at. Bestemed alliterates on the S rather than the B. It often appears alongside the Old English word for blood, which is blod, but it doesn't actually alliterate with this word, suggesting that its use in poetry is more deliberate than simply being part of the alliterative pattern. Sometimes, however, it does alliterate with swat, which is a general Old English word that can mean sweat or blood or any bodily effusion. So in this excerpt from The Dream of the Rood, I saw that eager beacon change its clothing and color. At once it was drenched with moisture, coursing with bloody flow. At once it was with treasure geared out. So here we can see that bestemed is not part of its own line's alliterative pattern. However, it does show continued alliteration with the next line, with beswiled and swates. The continuity of alliteration mirrors the fluidity of the transformation of the cross at this point in the poem. The narrator is going through changes in his own emotions. He's said to be afflicted with sorrow and also afraid. And the cross has changed as well. In this small excerpt, we can see it's drenched with moisture, it's coursing with bloody flow, and geared out with treasure. This moment in the poem is about metamorphosis, and the continued alliteration aids the transition between one alliterative pattern and the next, giving the sense of the language as well as the images it presents, wetness and gore and treasure, flowing together. Weitan can be a verb or a noun. Here it's probably a noun, and it's an ambiguous word. It stands in for general wetness, so it could be translated as moisture, it could be translated as sweat or tears or blood, any of the above. Blood seems to be the most likely conclusion, because there are instances later in the poem of the language, specifically the verbs that we see here, being echoed. So here the cross is geared out with treasure in line 23, and later people gear it out with gold and silver in 77. The cross is drenched with moisture in line 22, and later we come across the second instance of bestemed in the poem, which refers to blood specifically in line 48. So here it occurs with the Old English blod. It can only be translated one way, which is blood. So from this analysis, we can see that bestemed is being used of blood, even though the word blod is not explicitly used. We can also see that bestemed was used by Anglo-Saxon poets for stylistic purposes, besides its connotative and denotative meaning. In all but one instance, it is used to talk about blood. Furthermore, in the Dictionary of Old English, the definition of bestemed is to bedew. I think that it implies a larger quantity of liquid than bedew does. We can see this because bestemed often appears next to other verbs that are intensifiers. It's often alongside other verbs that refer to the gushing out of large quantities of liquid. It appears next to beswiled and also begoten in the first passage. These are both intensifying verbs. Begoten means to pour out, which implies a large quantity. We can also see this happening in Andreas. In this passage, it says, "The body of that holy man was sodden with sore wounds, bedewed with blood, his bone house broken. Blood welled out in waves of hot gore." This passage seems very intense. It seems like the quantity of blood is immense. The fact that the blood is said to well out in waves here suggests that bestemed, used of the same blood a line earlier, connotes an intense coursing out of liquid. This trend of seeing verbs describing the movement of blood as intense, violent, and in large quantities continues in Exodus. So here it says, "The mountain slopes were coursing with blood, the sea spewed gore." So bestemed appears alongside spa, which is a word that means to spew, spit out, or vomit. It also implies a certain violence in the movement of liquid. Looking at the places where besteumen occurs, we might say that in all but 3 instances it's used in relation to a servant of God. It's used often to refer to the cross that Christ was crucified on, and it's used when the cannibals torture Andreas and later to heal his body. It's also used when Andreas proves his faith in God by enduring a journey on rough seas, which we explored in the introduction. He asks God, disguised as a helmsman, how he is able to control the ship, which he calls a surging sea stallion. The entire sea travel episode can be seen as a device to showcase Andreas's endurance of hardship in the name of the Lord, and specifically his continued belief in God's salvation, which enables him to survive the sea storm. In the Dream of the Rood, it's clear that the cross is suffering as God does. As God is crucified and tortured by the Romans, it's emphasized that the cross is being mocked with him and is in pain alongside Christ. So we can conclude that besteumen might connote a specifically Christian suffering when it talks about blood. This is just one part of the analysis for one of the words that I want to look at as part of my field study. It's important to look at a large range of words that are both general and specific so that a full picture of the field can be formed. The corpus of Old English and the Dictionary of Old English have enabled a lot of research to take place that couldn't have before. We've also seen it's very productive to do this because by examining besteumen in context, it appears to have a very different definition than the official one in the Dictionary of Old English or elsewhere. I would probably define it more closely as to drench or to course. So in conclusion, I feel that it's important to undertake more semantic field studies of Old English, and especially investigating how Anglo-Saxon people related to water. And I think it's very rewarding to examine the words in the context in which they appear and define them more specifically.